I thank the member for Lindsay. The question now is that these bills be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Wills.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The member for Lindsay talks up the Coalition's Direct Action Plan, but I have very little confidence that the Direct Action Plan will deliver effective carbon emissions reductions. I believe they will not do anything of the kind, and the question that the House needs to ask in considering the bills before it is whether this is the best way to go to reduce emissions or whether there are better ones. And I believe that the best way to reduce carbon emissions is to transition to renewable energy. And I want to praise Clive Palmer, the member for Fairfax, for his announcement that his senators will vote to keep the renewable energy target. I also want to praise the member for Fairfax for indicating that his senators will not vote for two of the bills in the package before the House, that is to say the Clean Energy Finance Corporation Abolition Bill and the Climate Change Authority Abolition Bill. Deputy Speaker, this is inconvenient for Prime Minister Abbott, but very encouraging news for the planet. It is an inconvenient truth for the government that jobs and investment in regional areas in solar panels, solar hot water and high-efficiency appliances are contributing billions of dollars worth of economic activity each year. It is an inconvenient truth for this government that over 14% of Australia's power was produced by renewable energy in the 2013 calendar year. It is an inconvenient truth for this government that more than 2 million household clean energy systems have now been installed across the country, with the majority being either solar power or solar hot water. It is an inconvenient truth for this government that investment in Australian clean energy during 2013 was, for the third successive year, over $5 billion. It is an inconvenient truth for this government that at the end of 2013, over 20,000 people were employed in the renewable energy industry. It is an inconvenient truth for this government that last year the 140-turbine Macarthur wind farm, largest in the Southern Hemisphere, led one of the best years of large-scale renewable energy in recent years. 705 megawatts of new projects came online. And it is an inconvenient truth for this government that, perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, the renewable energy target will actually lead to lower power prices. Modelling completed for the Clean Energy Council by leading energy market experts Rome Consulting found that power bills would actually be more than $500 million cheaper across all Australian households in 2020 with the renewable energy target in place than if it was removed. Beyond 2020, this figure is even higher, rising to a maximum of $140 cheaper per household, or a $1.4 billion total saving on power bills. This is because fewer renewables, such as wind and solar, would mean more of our energy would have to come from gas-fired electricity, which is getting more expensive all the time. Indeed, the Australian Industry Group, which represents many of the country's large manufacturers and other energy users, said this year that the rising price of gas is emerging as possibly the biggest energy issue we face. They and others have projected that gas prices may triple this decade, causing massive problems for some of our more energy-intensive industries. Now, I've talked about the impact of rising gas prices on both manufacturers and consumers previously, and I regret that no action is being taken to protect consumers from rising energy bills. Cutting the RET would make matters worse. And regrettably, the legislated review of the renewable energy target has undermined confidence in the industry and undermined investment. The Liberal Party is quick to cry foul and make hysterical claims about sovereign risk if a Labor government takes any action which impacts on any company's bottom line, but the way in which it subjects the renewable energy industry to constant policy changes and rough handling beggars belief. These are real industries, mostly in regional areas, providing a real service in a carbon-constrained world. They are the industries of the future. They are certainly the industries that economies from China to the US and Europe are now embracing, and they deserve better. Deputy Speaker, this government's record on climate change has been quite shameful. It is not just the axing of the Climate Commission and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. It's not just the inquiry into the renewable energy target or the shameful international positions the government has taken, saying no country can be expected to sacrifice resource revenue to tackle climate change. Is the Prime Minister not aware that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment? No environment, no economy. But it's worse than that. The Prime Minister appointed Maurice Newman as chairman of his Business Advisory Council. Mr Newman has described climate change as a scientific delusion and says Australia is hostage to climate change madness and accuses the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of dishonesty and deceit. And the Prime Minister makes this man his key business advisor. Deputy Speaker, is it a scientific delusion that in Australia average air temperatures have increased by 0.9 degrees Celsius since 1910? Is it a scientific delusion that since the 1950s every decade has been warmer than the one before it? Is it a scientific delusion that 2013 was Australia's hottest year since records began more than a century ago? Given these facts, it would be crazy for governments and business not to take the forecasts seriously. These forecasts include more heat waves, more droughts and more bushfires. It would be imprudent and negligent for either government or business to ignore this. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has predicted the displacement of between 13 million and 94 million people in South, Southeast and East Asia from an increase in the size and intensity of tropical cyclones and resulting storm surges. And the tragedy of disasters like this is that they are avoidable. The renewable energy industry has the capacity, if only we helped it rather than trying to strangle it, to take us down a very different path. In March, the CEO of the Clean Energy Council, David Green, said solar PV was transitioning from being disruptive technology to being incumbent technology. Deputy Speaker, this is very significant indeed. Climate change is a serious issue that demands a serious and effective response. It is time for the Prime Minister to acknowledge the flaws in what is an expensive, inefficient and ineffective direct action policy. Labor's position on climate change has not changed. We will not support the repeal of the carbon price unless there is a credible alternative that will deliver meaningful action to tackle climate change. We already voted to abolish the carbon tax in the Senate and replace it with an emissions trading scheme, and we will do so again when it comes before the Senate. Deputy Speaker, the Australian Government's Climate Change Authority, a body which this government wants to silence and shut down and kill off through one of these bills, has indicated that climate change is unequivocal and that the human influence on the climate system is clear, that Australia should be pursuing a stronger target, that taken as a whole, the government's conditions for moving beyond a 5% reduction appear to have been met, that 99 countries are acting on emissions. These include Australia's major trading partners, covering over 80% of global emissions and 90% of economic output, that China and the US are stepping up efforts to reduce emissions. Both have targets. China is investing heavily in renewable energy, closing power plants and trialling market mechanisms to reduce emissions. And indeed, the authority's analysis shows that Australia can achieve a 15 to 25% reduction target while national income and the economy continue to grow. Now, I said the member for Lindsay talked about direct action, and yesterday the government put forward to replace Labor's initiatives, the initiatives which these bills seek to kill off, a bill to broaden the carbon farming initiative to turn it into a key plank of the government's direct action policy. Now, that bill uses the mechanism of an emissions reduction fund. My concern is that the emissions reduction fund will turn into a $2.5 billion dressed-up slush fund, paying large corporations for things that they were going to do anyway. And I say this after closely examining the legal advice about that bill provided by Environmental Justice Australia, formerly known as the Environment Defenders Office, to the Australian Conservation Foundation. And let me express great concern at the decision by the government in December last year to withdraw funding from the Environment Defenders Office. It is a very short-sighted decision, and I take this opportunity to urge the Liberal government to reconsider it. Environmental Justice Australia has said that it is very difficult to properly assess the scheme because important details are left to other legislation, to legislative rules, to the discretion of the executive, or to the details of individual contracts that will be entered into between the Commonwealth and project proponents. Environmental Justice Australia notes that the scheme being created gives a large degree of discretion to the executive and the relevant minister. Even when there are specific criteria or conditions set out in the bill, they're subject to executive variation, and of course this creates further uncertainty about the operation and effectiveness of the scheme. They also raise serious concerns about the mechanics of the scheme. For example, sequestration offset projects can have a permanence period of either 25 or 100 years. That's to say the period for which the proponent has an obligation to maintain the project and ensure that sequestered emissions are not released back into the atmosphere can vary. So if you nominate a 25-year permanence period, you're subject to a 20% reduction in the number of carbon credits you're entitled to. The White Paper and the explanatory memorandum say the 20% discount will cover the cost of replacing carbon stores if the projects are discontinued. But why the government believes that only 1 in 5 projects will go for 25 years rather than 100 years in these circumstances is very unclear. I'm also concerned about upfront payments. The White Paper says that the Emissions Reduction Fund will pay for emissions as they occur and will not provide upfront payments. But the White Paper says in certain circumstances there will be ways to deem or pre-calculate emissions reductions from certain activities. So the risk is that payments may be made for emissions that do not ultimately materialise. And furthermore, the scheme contains no explicit mechanism that relates to the performance of any contractual obligation and no penalties for failure to deliver the contracted quantity of carbon credit units. So, Deputy Speaker, if the only way that you can enforce a breach of contract is therefore through the common law, there can be little doubt that the absence of a penalty mechanism to promote compliance will act as a significant barrier to ensuring that contractual obligations are fulfilled. I also note that while Part 12 requires the regulator to publish information about the scheme, proponents actually get 5 years to report on projects, so it will not be possible to assess the effectiveness of the direct action scheme for a considerable period of time. Last week I spoke in the House about a delegation from the Australian Conservation Foundation who had come to advise members of a petition from tens of thousands of Australians urging us not to drop the ball on climate action. And they said to us as members of Parliament, for 2 years now, Australia has had a set of laws called the Clean Energy Future Package, widely known by the public as the carbon tax. What is less known, they said, is that it is working. Australia's carbon price is doing its job of cutting our pollution, making it a safer, healthier country for all of us, while also doing our fair share in the effort to tackle global warming. We now know that in the past 12 months, Australia's carbon pollution levels dropped by more than it has in the past 24 years. We know that the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, part of the package, is making a profit while cutting pollution, and we know that this is happening while the economy is growing at 3.5% in the past year. Australians want to see us take action. 86% of Australians want us to cut our carbon pollution. 45% see global warming as a serious and pressing problem, a figure that is up 9% from only 2 years ago. Deputy Speaker, the Australian public are speaking up. They are worried about global warming and they want Australia to do its bit. We have the laws already in place that are working incredibly well. and they ask us as parliamentarians to listen to Australian people concerning this and to vote to keep these laws in place, and I'll be voting to do just that.
I thank the member for Wills.